when a guard would stop and talk to you, you used to stand back and you would yell so people could hear what you were saying to that guard as they walked by or within the vicinity.
But he knew what a convict was going to do before they thought of it themselves. He'd just been around that long, and he was tough.
They'd find Sparky in about every conceivable place you could imagine, which we would, of course, dump.
They'd wait until everybody was locked up, and he would open his door and run down to cell 1 and get a bugler can full of Sparky and take it back to his cells.
She had a kind of a hypnotic power. There were a great many wild cats around the penitentiary, and most people couldn't get near them. But she would stand in the doorway of the cell house and say, "Kitty, kitty, kitty," and those cats would go to her.
Thank you for tuning into Stool, Pigeon Saturday. Today, Skye and I are in the studio speaking to a special guest who is across the country in the 90.5 WESA studio in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. She's the author of the juvenile fiction book Prisoner 88, based on the story of Idaho's youngest inmate, 10-year-old James Oscar Baker, who was incarcerated in 1885 for a charge of manslaughter after killing a man who attacked his father in a bar fight in eastern Idaho. Leah Pileggi, thank you for speaking with us today.
It's so great to talk with you guys.
Well, I think we could start out. Just can you tell us a little about yourself and your work and what inspires your writing?
I never really thought of myself as a writer growing up, and not until my daughter was a toddler did I realize how much I loved children's books. Because as she got older, I sort of stuck with the children's books, and I started learning to write in the children's genre. And so what happened with this story is that I was in Boise, Idaho, with my husband, who was on a business trip. And I had about 2 hours to kill. So I had seen in a local newspaper about the old Idaho Penitentiary, go visit. And I love historic places. So I went and took the tour. And it was a very hot day. It was in May. Mm-hmm. And as you know, of course, the tour is mostly outside. And so the people were going to their cars to try and get cold because it was really hot outside. But I stayed for the entire tour. And at the very end, the docent said that the youngest prisoner ever held there was 10 years old. And because I was studying children's writing, my first thought was, wow, I want to read that book. So I went back home to Pittsburgh, and I started doing a little reading, a little research, and come to find out there wasn't much that was known about him. So I began to think maybe this is my book to write. And that's how it all got started.
Yeah, I mean, you kind of answered our next question, but really, what was it about his story that made you want to know more and start doing this digging and this research?
Well, first of all, thinking of a 10-year-old being in prison, being a mom, I just sort of couldn't quite comprehend that. So I had to find out why he was there. And one of the things I'd ask was, where did they put him? And the docent said, well, we assume that he lived with the warden and his wife or family and all. And so that seemed logical, but I wanted to find out if that was true. And I don't know why I just was so drawn to this story. It's sort of like it was sitting there waiting to be found, and it was mine to find.
Yeah, that's great. What was your process? Like, did you research first, or did you imagine the experience, kind of write it, and then learn after writing it, learn more about James Oscar Baker's story?
I did a lot of research first, and what was interesting is I contacted some of your folks there at the Idaho State Historical Society, and there was a lot of information actually in a file or I don't know where they had it, but they came up with a lot of stuff. Newspaper clippings, the trial transcript. And so I had all of this great information to work with. So I did all of that first. I did all of the research. And I guess my character, whose name is Jake, a little bit different than the real person, I just tried to think about what his life might have been like while he was in there, because there weren't any documents that had anything that said like day to day what happened or what food he ate or where he actually stayed. So that part was going to be up to me.
Very good. So the book is written from a child's perspective, but it's in a place that we would really typically gear toward kind of an adult audience. And so who was your intended audience, and really what was your approach to writing this point of view? Because I would imagine that is kind of a challenge as you're approaching this idea.
I was studying children's literature and actually doing writing for children. So I knew that that's my audience. I wanted it to be kids that would be that age, to read about someone in a whole different time in history and what they went through. So my intended audience was always ages 10 and up, and that's been a kind of a sweet spot for the book. It's fifth grade. It's been on some state reading lists for kids at that age. But I have to say, and this is going to sound kind of strange for people who aren't writers, but as I was writing the book, I sort of let Jake write his own story. I mean, there were days when I was writing, and I would look back on what I'd written the day before, and I didn't really remember that. And I would think, oh, that sounds really good. So it's something that happens when you're writing. Sometimes the character just really takes over.
Yeah, I really like the perspective in the book. I like that you kept with this young man kind of experiencing this hard, rough world. It's really fascinating. I was curious, do you have any excerpts from the book that our listeners could hear you read?
I do. I have two things that I picked out. One of this is very, very short, and then there's another one that's just a little bit longer. So there was an inmate that a character in the book. His name is Mr. Nance, and he had told Jake that if he needed someone to talk to, he would be there for him. So Jake decides he's going to try to reach out. Locked back up in my cell, I walked one end to the other, to the other, to the other. Couldn't hardly stretch out my legs. All that walking, I got to thinking how Mr. Nance said I could talk to him if need be. I leaned against the bars. Mr. Nance, you there? I didn't get no answer from him. Instead, a squeaky voice down a ways yelled, "He's hauling wood today, you little sissy." That burned me. I'd have liked to put that old squeaky-voiced man in my own prison, a secret prison. I imagined him smaller than me and with a head of nothing but mouth. "You ain't even getting bread, you old mouth. You just stay on in there and rot." And then I felt a whole lot better. Because I imagine someone that age, or even any inmate, you have to spend a lot of time in your head, making things up, coming up with ways to just cope with things.
Absolutely.
And do you mind if I ask, because the fact that you made Mr. Nance and his other cellmate, and I apologize, I can't remember his name right now, how you made them Mormon, was there a particular reason for that? Or was that just sort of one of those random creative choices?
Well, there were Mormon, what they called cohabs in the penitentiary at that exact time, because this was right before the cohabitation they didn't do that in the church anymore. So there were, in fact, prisoners in there just for that reason. But they weren't violent people at all, of course. And it just seemed logical to me that this particular man might be a Mormon who would reach out to try to help our little kid.
Yeah, and we have actually journals from these individuals who are in for these plural marriages, unlawful cohabitation, and they write about, being teachers and kind of being the first trustees and performing music and being given a lot of freedom. So when I was reading that, and I totally saw Nance being this role model for this little 10-year-old boy.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a good depiction of that.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah, has this inspired you to write any more about the prison experience? Have you written anything else kind of from this perspective of incarceration?
I've done a lot of reading. I haven't really written anything else. because mainly I like the historical aspect of things, but I have read a lot of things, of course, about current cases. And anytime I see a case now where there's a young person who's incarcerated, I tend to read that. But I haven't really done any more writing about incarceration. And I have to say, it was a little bit tough because I had to put myself in his shoes sometimes and actually feel what it was like to be in a very small space. And it's not great. It's not good.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that is what's fun about understanding what goes on out here, is imagining yourself in those spaces and in those situations, and how totally harrowing and terrifying that would be, not just as a 10-year-old, but also as, someone much older than that as well. So I thought that was a really excellent part of the book. Now we were wondering how much, as you did your research, how much you were interested in kind of accurately depicting the history of the site and of James himself, versus how interested you were in just creating kind of a similar narrative and taking much more creative license, if that question makes sense.
It does. Every aspect of what I've put into this book is based on research. The food that they ate, the food that they grew, the fact that they took care of hogs, they did laundry, the way the place was set up. Everything is based on research that I had done. As far as the wire coming out and how they communicate, those things are all based on reality. So Jake's story of his inner world in his head is what I made up, but everything else is really based on a lot of research, which is really a lot of fun to get in and dig around and find out the truth about things.
Have you visited the site since that initial visit?
No, I haven't had a chance. I would love to.
Oh.
I would absolutely love to. But I've seen a lot of pictures, and I took a lot of pictures when I was there, and I feel like I know the place, but I would really like to go and just walk around and be there again. But there's one other section I wanted to read a little bit, too. Jake has kind of a quick voice, like when he sort of jumps in and talks too quickly sometimes, and he kind of got himself in trouble. He said he knew how to work with hogs when this came up in conversation. So sure enough, they're going to have him work with hogs. But so this is him starting off on the first day. And of course, he'll have to leave the penitentiary and be walked over by a guard so that he can work with the hogs on a farm. Henry is the guard who's he didn't necessarily get assigned to work with Jake, but it just has sort of worked out that way. And Henry's a kind of a really good guy and is watching out for Jake. Me and Henry started out. The air felt nice and cool because it was early, but it was going to be hot, I could tell. We hiked about a mile or so, up a rise and down a rise, and around past some scraggly old trees till we got to the hogs. Wasn't no wind blowing, so I didn't know I was there till I was there. It didn't smell nothing like that other hog farm me and Pa worked. It weren't bad at all. We stood at the fence that surrounded the pen. A sea of mostly black hogs moved around inside, grunting and snuffling. One of them headed on over to me, sticking his snout through the fence, giving me a sniff. Then it went for my bootlace. I hopped up to the middle slat of the fence and stepped sideways along the rail, but that hog kept right on after my lace. You break it, you fix it. I jumped on down and stepped away from the fence, and there come the man who said those words. He was shuffling along the fence, all slumped over at the shoulders like he was looking permanent at the ground. He stopped right in front of me and Henry. Henry said to the top of the man's head, "This here's Jake, Mr. Criswell." Mr. Criswell bent his whole body back to look me up and down. His right young-looking face didn't match with his bent-over self. His eyes was the same blue as the sky. "You break that fence rail, you fix it. Don't make work, Jake," said Mr. Criswell. "Yes, sir." We three men just stood looking for a minute, Henry and me at the hogs, Mr. Criswell at a spot between his feet. He said, "Just looks like a whole bunch of pigs, doesn't it, Jake?" "Yes, sir," I said, 'cause it was just a whole bunch of pigs. He said, "That's a lot of cooking fat and pork meat." He pointed over the fence past the heap of pig bodies. "That fella there is our boar." I couldn't miss him. He was covered in bristly hair, mostly black with some white patches. He stood in a small pen all to himself, and he was bigger than the bathtub in the washing cell. Mr. Criswell said, "There's 6 sows and 45 good-sized pigs." I didn't know what to say about that. I couldn't count up that high, so I hoped that wasn't what he was getting at. Mr. Criswell was chewing on a piece of straw. "I was told you know your way around a hog, Jake." Why did I have to go and say that? Well, me and Pa worked a couple days on a hog farm. Pa did some shoveling and cleaning up, but mostly I could have maybe made something up, but I figured Mr. Criswell could tell I didn't know nothing about hogs. I mostly played with a big old cat that hung around, and I fell off the roof of the barn. Mr. Criswell seemed like he was nodding in agreement, or maybe his head was just sort of bouncing up and down a little bit all by itself when he laughed. "An expert," he said. I was thinking, shut your smart mouth, but my gut knew he was right. "Get yourself a shovel there," he pointed off a ways. Henry said, "Looks like you're set, Jake." And then right after he took off, I seen a scrawny old yellow gold cat chasing after him. I looked away from that cat so fast, I about snapped my own neck. No more cats and no more roofs.
Yeah, I like that you bring in all of this extra work because this institution was constructed by convicts. They made sure to keep everybody busy, not only growing and raising cattle and growing food, but constructing the walls and the buildings that they were even housed in themselves. Right. So I really like that you included that. And then the cat at the end, his relationship with the cat, is really fun to watch. Well,
another interesting part about this whole story is that I didn't know anything about pigs. I didn't know anything about raising pigs or all of this. So I actually did some research. I spoke with a professor of animal husbandry from Penn State University about hogs and about how to raise them. And then he referred me to someone, I believe it was in Iowa, who was a hog farmer. And between the two of them, they sent pictures to me. So that's how I know exactly what it looks like when hogs are born. So, that was an interesting piece of research.
Mm-hmm. I always find as a creative writer that you end up going down these rabbit holes and knowing more about the most random subjects
right.
than you thought you would ever know in your life.
Right.
The random advertisements in the 1920s that might have been up on, in Times Square or whatever.
Yes.
Those sort of things. So I appreciate, that rabbit hole that you found yourself down, because obviously it lends some awesome realism to the story. Not that obviously the rest wasn't, but to understand, because I don't know anything about pigs either. So I appreciate that. So thank you for going down that rabbit hole for us.
The other fun part was finding out about dynamite, because you had mentioned, Anthony, about how they were actually using the inmates to, I guess, reinforce the wall, because the wall had been wood, and then they went out with dynamite. The inmates went out with dynamite and blasted the rock to bring it back. But I read a whole, it wasn't a master's thesis, but someone had done all this research about the inmates with the dynamite and blowing up the rock. So I know way more about that than I needed to know, too.
That's just kind of our job here. We learn all kinds of things like that, yeah. How to quarry stone, how to shape it, and it's amazing. Yeah. Well, can you tell us what you found about the real-life James Oscar Baker after his release?
Yeah, so my husband got interested in this, and he said, I wrote Jake as an only child, and his mother had died, and I think that focused the story really well. But my husband said, well, I have to find out if there's any records about this real person. So in fact, he's one of 13 siblings. So not exactly an only child. He was third of 13 children. And his mother, Miranda, I believe it is, lots of different spellings. And of course, as researchers, you'll find lots of different spellings for names. But apparently she was a healer using herbs to heal people, and she actually had some sort of connection to the Hole in the Wall gang. That she had some sort of cure for something. I'm not exactly sure what it was now, but and then his father, we found, had been in the Civil War and had been shot off his horse, and the horse landed on him, so his he couldn't move very well.
Wow.
And we think that's part of the reason that when this fight broke out in this saloon and that the real boy, James, picked up the gun and shot, it's probably because his father couldn't move very well because he had been wounded in the Civil War.
Yeah.
There's lots more about his family, too.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's amazing. And do you know how long he stayed here and who or how he was released?
I do know that. This is a spoiler for anyone who hasn't read the book. His sentence was 5 years, and he did not spend that much time in there. He was released early, and it's one of these combinations of stories which you can't be sure exactly what happened because even though these are primary sources, things are a little bit different. But the story essentially is that the people in the community thought that this just didn't make any sense to have this 10-year-old boy in the prison. And there were petitions being drawn up. And there was a man whose name was Cyrenius Mulkey, who had been a pioneer on the frontier. And when he was 83 years old, he wrote his story, his life story. And he was part of the reason that James, the real boy, was let go early. He was a friend of the governor at that time. And because people were saying, well, this boy shouldn't be in here anymore, he should be out. Well, people didn't like the boy's father. So the governor convinced his friend, Cyrenius Mulkey, that I'll let him go, but he's got to live with your family. And we do know that happened. We do know that when he was released, he did go with Cyrenius Mulkey and his wife. He was supposed to stay with that family until he was of age, which I don't know back then if that would have been 16 or 18 or whatever. But I think apparently he went actually immediately to be with his mother. But Cyrenius Mulkey was a really fascinating character, and we found this manuscript about his life in the library at the University of Washington. And he talks about shooting Indians, and it was just sort of a daily thing. But one thing he was really proud of was getting this young kid out of the penitentiary.
Yeah. Yeah, I thought you sent me about a 3-page excerpt from his autobiography, and I thought his discussion on, you don't understand frontier life like I do. And I really thought that was interesting that he kind of had some self-awareness as a 80-year-old man, writing his autobiography in a time when, it's just a little different perspective on Native Americans and white settlers then.
He was just being honest. That's just the way things were when he was a young man and he was on the trail. And But what was interesting, he'll say something about, got this little boy out and he had a sentence of 10 years. Well, the sentence was actually 5 years, but in other places like a newspaper clipping, you'll see it was 8 years. So, there's all that sort of, it's, a little bit of guesswork. But, he was an interesting character for sure. Now, I chose not to put that into the book. I had the ending is different because I didn't really want to wrap things up that tightly, and I like my ending. I think it's a hopeful ending to the book.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Did you were you able to find anything about James once he was out of the custody, once he became of age, basically? Were you able to find anything on kind of his later life?
We followed him through the census records, so we knew where he was. And he did ultimately go to Washington State, which was where his mother was. He was a laborer. He was married. He had, I believe, 3 children, 2 sons who did not go on to have families, but his daughter did have children. So I've actually spoken to, I believe it's a great granddaughter, and the family didn't really know much about him. But the most interesting family story is that his youngest brother was named Jess, and he was almost 20 years younger. And Jess didn't get married until he was in his 50s. And he and his wife had a daughter, Audrey, who's now in her 60s. So Audrey is actually James Oscar Baker's niece, and she's still living. Of course, he had died before she met him, but it was just one generation removed.
And that's really interesting to think about, because I think we think about the fact that this penitentiary was incarcerating a 10-year-old. That must have been almost 100 years ago. And so to think about the fact that we still have someone living, just a one generation link back to him, that's amazing.
It is.
And, as researchers, that's what we live for. And so I appreciate you, finding that, because that's blows my mind a little bit.
She filled in some of the blanks for me about a couple of things, but then I told her some things that the family didn't know. So it's been a really interesting relationship. She's just a very sweet person. She actually shared some photographs. So I do have a few photographs of James when he was an old man, pretty much right. He lived into the 1940s. So
wow, that's impressive. That's some great research you've done. Wow.
But that's also what's great about working with each other, is that, we don't have access to this, we didn't write this book, and we don't have the time and resources to dig into these stories. But thankfully, with Leah, she can, bridge that gap for us, and we can bridge the gap for her. And that's what's so great about working together, and not just leaving it up to you or leaving it up to us, is that we can all kind of get this information from each other.
Right, fill in all the gaps that we can.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Now, have you had any readers reach out to you with stories or anything like that?
I've gotten book reviews from adult book groups and from 9-year-olds. And pretty much everyone in between. It's been really great. It was the honor book in the state of Arkansas a couple of years ago, and that's voted on by something like 60,000 school-age kids. So it's just the kids who vote on the book, and so I do Skype visits with schools, and I love the questions that kids come up with.
What's one that you get the most?
Oh gosh. It's tough to say, because it's all over the place. Sometimes some of the questions have to do with the writing process itself. Some of them have to do with while I visited there, what I saw. So it's really all over, and I get new questions all the time, surprisingly.
And you told me something about somebody reaching out to you with paranormal experience. Would you be interested in speaking about that?
Yeah, it was just so apparently there was a little 5-year-old boy who was with a group taking a tour of the old pen a couple of years ago, and your typical rambunctious 5-year-old kid. But when they got inside the grounds of the penitentiary, he got very serious, and he sort of walked in as though he knew where he was going. And one of the adults with him asked what was going on, and he said, I used to live here. He said, I worked here, and I was here because of my father. And they asked, well, who are you? And he said, my name's Baker. And there isn't really any way that this little 5-year-old kid who couldn't even read yet would have known anything about this book or about the research. But then one of the adults with him sort of did some digging and found my book and reached out to me and sort of asked some questions. So I don't know. I don't know what was going on. But I can't help thinking that James Oscar Baker was somehow, reaching out and saying, find my story. So, yeah.
Huh. That is very interesting. I don't even know what to say to that. I think I mouthed to Anthony, "Shut up." I can't believe that's crazy.
Yeah, I have no explanation. I really don't.
Yeah.
Well, awesome. Where can listeners find your book so that they can, follow up with this awesome interview that we've done?
Any place that any of the large book chains, I go to your local independent bookstores. We love local indies.
Yeah.
Ask them to order it if they don't have it in. You can get it through the publisher, which is Charlesbridge. They are in Massachusetts, and you can go to their website. And they also have some other things on there, too, for teachers about some worksheets that you can use with students. So really, anywhere that you can buy books, you can buy this. And what's interesting is that it's been out for a few years, but it just came out in the paperback edition just this month. And so now I hope that more teachers and more librarians will be able to purchase it and be able to use it with their kids.
Yeah, and that would be an excellent resource for Idaho teachers. A ton of fourth graders. That's our year for Idaho history. That's they come visit every year, and so that would be a really great resource for all our teachers out there to supplement their visit with this book.
Well, that would be great. And if there's any way that you can spread the word to them, that would be terrific. My publisher would love
teachers,
that.
if you're listening.
Well, that's fantastic. Do you have anything else you want to add, Leah?
I'm just so excited that you folks are doing all the podcasts and everything about the inmates there, because it's such an interesting place. And I'm so glad that we finally got together and had a chance to do this.
Me
Thank
too.
you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for agreeing to chat with us from such a long distance.
Yep. But it sounds like you're right next door.
Oh, yeah. That's great. All right. Well, we like to end our show with a call out. Basically, we say, do your own time.
And you would say?
And in this case, it's James Oscar Baker's number, 88.
Ooh,
there you
that's
go.
Great.
We really appreciate you talking to us, Leah.
Thanks so much, guys.
Have a great day.
All right, you too.
Take care. The paperback edition of Prisoner 88 by Leah Pileggi will be available in our gift shop soon. Pick up a copy the next time you visit. If you enjoyed Behind Gray Walls, please rate, review, and subscribe so others can find our podcast. If you're interested in more Old Idaho Penitentiary information and to see mugshots of the inmates featured in this episode, follow the Old Idaho Penitentiary on Instagram and Facebook. If you want to learn more about the Idaho State Historical Society and its other sites, follow ID State Historical Society on Instagram or visit history.idaho.gov. If you have a question or comment for the hosts, please email us at behindgraywalls@gmail.com.